My name is Sarah, and I'm 25 years old. For the past 3 years, I've been working as a transplant coordinator at St. Mary's Medical Center, one of the most prestigious hospitals in the city. People always underestimate me because of my age. They see a young woman in scrubs and assume I'm just another nurse who doesn't understand the complexities of organ transplantation. But what they don't know is that I've facilitated over 200 successful transplants in my career. I've built a network of contacts across 12 states, relationships forged through years of late-night calls, emergency flights, and the shared mission of saving lives. Every coordinator in the region knows my name, and more importantly, they trust me. That trust would become the most powerful weapon I never knew I had. The cardiac ICU at St. Mary's is where miracles and tragedies dance together every single day. Room 304 had been occupied for 6 weeks by Mrs. Eleanor Crest, a 73-year-old woman whose heart was failing so rapidly that even the most optimistic cardiologists spoke in whispers about her chances. She had been at the top of our heart transplant list for 2 months, her blood type O negative making her both a priority and a challenge. O negative hearts are rare, and when they become available, there's usually a line of hospitals competing for them. Mrs. Crest's son, Dr. Marcus Crest, was the chief cardiovascular surgeon at our hospital. He was a man who commanded respect through fear rather than admiration, whose reputation for surgical excellence was matched only by his reputation for treating staff like disposable equipment. But watching his mother slowly fade away had transformed his usual arrogance into something darker, something desperate. Every morning, Dr. Crest would arrive at the hospital at 5:30, 30 minutes before his usual time, just to sit beside his mother's bed. He would hold her hand, stroke her gray hair, and whisper promises that everything would be okay. Then, at 6 o'clock sharp, he would transform back into the cold, demanding surgeon everyone feared. He would storm out of that room and immediately begin terrorizing the staff about why we hadn't found his mother a heart yet. He would question every decision, every protocol, every phone call I made. In his mind, his mother's condition was a reflection of our collective failure, and he made sure everyone knew it. I remember the morning everything started to unravel. It was a Tuesday, and I had just finished reviewing the latest donor registry updates when Dr. Crest approached my desk. His eyes were bloodshot, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his hands were trembling slightly. He leaned over my desk, close enough that I could smell the coffee and desperation on his breath, and said, "Sarah, I need to know exactly what you're doing to find my mother a heart. I want a detailed report of every call you've made, every contact you've reached out to, every single effort you've made in the past 48 hours. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that I had never heard before. I pulled up my logs and began explaining the 17 calls I had made to various organ procurement organizations, the 3 potential donors that had been ruled out due to incompatibility, and the ongoing communications with coordinators in 5 different states. As I spoke, I watched his face grow more and more frustrated. When I finished, he stood up straight, looked down at me, and said, "That's it? That's what you call aggressive pursuit? My mother is dying, and you're sitting here making routine phone calls like you're ordering office supplies." The humiliation of that moment still burns in my chest. Here I was, a coordinator who had saved hundreds of lives, being lectured by a man who had never spent a single day doing my job. But I kept my composure, took a deep breath, and replied, "Dr. Crest, I understand your frustration, but I'm following all established protocols. I've contacted every available resource, and I'm monitoring the situation continuously. The moment a compatible heart becomes available, I'll know about it." He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head and walked away. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The next few days were a blur of increasing pressure and mounting tension. Dr. Crest began micromanaging every aspect of my work. He would stand behind my desk while I made phone calls, listening to every word. He would demand to see my notes, my contact lists, my scheduling. He started copying hospital administration on emails, questioning my competence, my dedication, my ability to handle such a critical case. The other nurses began avoiding me, not because they blamed me, but because they knew that associating with me meant potentially becoming targets of Dr. Crest's wrath. I felt isolated, scrutinized, and utterly alone in my efforts to save his mother's life. On Thursday afternoon, I received a call that initially seemed like the answer to everyone's prayers. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Organ Procurement Organization in Chicago called to tell me about a potential donor. A 32-year-old man had been declared brain dead following a motorcycle accident. He was O negative, his heart was in excellent condition, and his family had consented to donation. The timeline was tight, but everything seemed to align perfectly. I immediately called Dr. Crest, who was in surgery, and left a detailed message with his assistant. I then began coordinating with the surgical team, the anesthesiologists, and the transport crew. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. But organ transplantation is a cruel mistress, and hope can be snatched away in an instant. 3 hours later, Dr. Walsh called back with devastating news. The donor's family had changed their minds. The man's wife, who had initially agreed to the donation, had been convinced by her religious advisor that her husband's organs should remain intact. In a matter of minutes, Mrs. Crest's chance at life had evaporated. I sat at my desk, staring at the phone, knowing that I would have to deliver this news to Dr. Crest. I knew that no matter how professionally I handled it, he would find a way to blame me for this failure. When Dr. Crest emerged from surgery and received the news, his reaction was swift and brutal. He didn't wait for privacy or consideration for the other staff members present. Right there in the middle of the cardiac ICU, in front of nurses, residents, and even some patients' families, he unleashed his fury. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "This is the kind of incompetence that's going to kill my mother. You should have secured that heart. You should have convinced that family. You should have done something, anything, to make sure this didn't happen." His face was red, his fists were clenched, and spittle was flying from his mouth as he spoke. "I've been watching you for weeks, Sarah, and I'm not impressed. You're too young, too inexperienced, too passive for this job. You sit at your desk making phone calls like you're working at a call center instead of fighting for people's lives." The entire ICU had gone silent. Nurses stopped what they were doing. Residents looked down at their feet. Even the constant beeping of monitors seemed quieter. I stood there, my face burning with embarrassment and anger, trying to maintain some shred of professional dignity. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I had done everything right, that the family's decision was beyond my control, that organ donation is a complex process that depends on factors no coordinator can influence. But before I could speak, Dr. Crest continued his tirade. "You know what? I'm done with this. I'm done with your excuses, your protocols, your professional limitations. My mother doesn't have time for your learning curve. You're fired, Sarah. Clear out your desk and get out of my hospital. We'll find someone who actually knows how to do this job." The word fired hit me like a physical blow. In 3 years of working at St. Mary's, I had never received a single complaint about my performance. I had consistently exceeded all metrics for successful transplant coordination. I had worked holidays, weekends, and countless overtime hours. I had held the hands of families saying goodbye to their loved ones and celebrated with recipients as they got their second chance at life. And now, in front of everyone I worked with, I was being dismissed like an incompetent intern. The injustice of it was overwhelming, but what hurt even more was the realization that Mrs. Crest, an innocent woman who had done nothing wrong, was now going to suffer because of her son's pride and anger. I looked around the ICU at my colleagues, searching for someone who might defend me, or at least show some sign of support. But everyone was looking away, too afraid of Dr. Crest's power to risk their own careers. I understood their silence, but it didn't make it hurt any less. I walked to my desk, began packing my personal belongings into a cardboard box, and tried to ignore the whispers and stares that followed me. As I cleaned out my drawers, I found a photo of Mrs. Crest that I had printed out to remind myself of the human face behind all the medical charts and phone calls. She was smiling in the picture, probably taken years ago when she was healthy and happy. I stared at that photo for a long moment, then slipped it into my pocket. The drive home was a blur of tears and rage. I had lost my job, my reputation, and my source of income in a matter of minutes. But as I sat in my apartment that evening, surrounded by boxes of my belongings from the hospital, I realized that what bothered me most wasn't what Dr. Crest had done to me. It was what he had done to his mother. By firing me, he had potentially cost her the one person who had the best chance of finding her a heart. My replacement, whoever that might be, would have to start from scratch, building relationships and learning the intricacies of the transplant network that I had spent years developing. Mrs. Crest didn't have years. She barely had days. He took my job, my badge, and my dignity. But there was one thing he couldn't take: my oath. If you've ever been knocked down but refused to stay down, subscribe to Hospital Revenge, because my revenge was just beginning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mrs. Crest lying in that hospital bed, unaware that her son had just destroyed her best chance at survival. I thought about the oath I had taken when I became a healthcare professional, the promise to do no harm and to always put patient welfare first. Dr. Crest had forgotten that oath in his anger and desperation, but I hadn't. I realized that my commitment wasn't to the hospital or to any individual doctor. My commitment was to the patients, to the people who depended on me to be their bridge between death and life. And Mrs. Crest was still my patient, whether her son acknowledged it or not. I got up from bed and went to my home office, where I kept detailed records of all my professional contacts. Over the years, I had developed relationships with transplant coordinators across the country, relationships built on mutual respect and shared experiences. These weren't just professional connections. They were friends who had worked beside me in the trenches of life and death medicine. I had helped many of them navigate difficult cases, shared resources, and provided support during their most challenging moments. Now, I was going to ask for help in return. I pulled out my personal cell phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for David Martinez, a transplant coordinator at Denver General Hospital. David and I had worked together on a complex case 2 years earlier, when a young father in Denver needed a liver transplant, and I had helped facilitate the donation of a compatible organ from a donor in our region. The case had been complicated, requiring extensive coordination between multiple hospitals and transport teams, but we had pulled it off successfully. The man had lived, and David had never forgotten the extra effort I had put in to make it happen. It was nearly midnight when I called David, but I knew he would answer. Transplant coordinators don't keep regular hours. We're always on call, always ready to drop everything when a life hangs in the balance. David picked up on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "Sarah, is everything okay? It's pretty late for a social call." I took a deep breath and began to explain the situation. I told him about Mrs. Crest's condition, her blood type, her urgency level, and her prognosis. I didn't mention her son or the circumstances of my dismissal. I simply presented the medical facts and asked if he would keep an eye out for any potential donors in his region. David listened without interruption, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sarah, this sounds like a really challenging case. The patient's age and condition make her a high-risk recipient, and you know how competitive the allocation process can be for O-negative hearts. But I'll tell you what, I'll put her information in our system and make sure our team knows to prioritize her if anything comes up. You've helped me out more times than I can count, and I owe you this favor." I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. This was exactly the kind of response I had hoped for, the kind of professional courtesy that makes the transplant community work. But David wasn't finished. "Actually, let me call a few other coordinators I know and see if anyone has heard anything about potential donors coming up. Sometimes we get advance notice about cases that might result in donation, and I can put the word out that we're looking for this specific match." I thanked him profusely, but he brushed off my gratitude. "Sarah, this is what we do. We save lives. It doesn't matter which hospital we work for or what politics are involved. When someone needs help, we help them." After I hung up with David, I made similar calls to 3 other coordinators in different regions. Each conversation was essentially the same. I presented Mrs. Crest's case as an urgent medical need, asked for their assistance, and received promises to prioritize her if any compatible donors became available. I didn't tell any of them about my employment situation or my personal connection to the case. As far as they knew, I was still working at St. Mary's and acting in my official capacity as a transplant coordinator. It was a gray area ethically, but I justified it by telling myself that I was still acting in the patient's best interest. Making that call could have gotten me in serious legal trouble. It was a huge risk. But the question I asked myself was, what's more important, my career or an innocent woman's life? Hit the like button on this video if you believe that doing the right thing sometimes means breaking the rules. By the time I finished making all my calls, it was nearly 3 in the morning. I felt emotionally drained but also strangely energized. I had done something concrete to help Mrs. Crest, something that her son's replacement coordinator wouldn't be able to do because they wouldn't have the relationships and trust that I had built over years of professional service. I had turned my network of contacts into a weapon, not for revenge against Dr. Crest, but for justice for his mother. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had fired me for incompetence had unknowingly sabotaged his mother's best chance at survival. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept racing. I thought about what would happen if my efforts were successful. If one of my contacts found a compatible heart for Mrs. Crest, the call would go through official channels to the hospital. Dr. Crest would never know that I had anything to do with it. He would probably credit his new transplant coordinator, or the hospital's reputation, or pure luck. The thought of him celebrating a success that was actually due to my intervention filled me with a complex mix of satisfaction and frustration. I wanted him to know that I had saved his mother's life, but I also realized that his ignorance would be the most poetic form of justice. The next morning, I woke up to my phone ringing. It was David Martinez, and his voice was filled with excitement. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this. We just got a call about a potential donor in Colorado Springs. 28-year-old female, O negative, excellent heart function, and the family is committed to donation. The donor is being maintained on life support, and the procurement surgery is scheduled for this afternoon. I've already contacted the allocation network, and based on the information you gave me, your patient should be the top priority for this heart." I felt my heart start racing. This was exactly what I had hoped for, but now that it was actually happening, I was filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "David, that's incredible news. What's the timeline looking like?" He explained that the donor evaluation would be completed within the next few hours, and if everything checked out, the heart would be available for transport by early evening. The recipient hospital would need to have their patient prepped and ready for surgery by the time the organ arrived. "I'm going to call the transplant coordinator at St. Mary's right now," David continued. "What's the name of the person I should speak with?" I realized that I had no idea who had replaced me or even if anyone had replaced me yet. It had only been 24 hours since I was fired, and finding a qualified transplant coordinator wasn't something that could be done overnight. "I think you should call the main transplant line and ask for whoever is handling cardiac cases," I told him. "The situation there is a little complicated right now." After David hung up, I sat in my kitchen, staring at my phone and trying to process what was happening. In less than 24 hours, my network of professional relationships had potentially solved a problem that had been plaguing St. Mary's for months. The heart that could save Mrs. Crest's life was becoming available, not because of any effort by Dr. Crest or his hospital, but because of contacts and relationships that I had built over years of dedicated service. The coordinator, who had been deemed incompetent and fired, was about to deliver the miracle that everyone had been praying for. I spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation. I couldn't call the hospital to check on the situation because I was no longer an employee. I couldn't reach out to my former colleagues because I didn't want to put them in an awkward position. All I could do was wait and hope that everything would proceed smoothly. I kept thinking about Mrs. Crest, imagining her lying in that hospital bed, unaware that her salvation was already in motion. I thought about Dr. Crest, probably pacing the halls and demanding updates from whoever was trying to fill my position. The thought of his anxiety and desperation didn't give me any satisfaction. I genuinely wanted his mother to survive, regardless of how he had treated me. Around 6 o'clock that evening, I received a text message from Jennifer Walsh, one of the nurses in the cardiac ICU. Jennifer and I had become friends over the years, and she had been one of the few people who had looked sympathetic when I was being fired. Her message was brief, but filled with excitement. "Sarah, you're not going to believe what's happening. A heart just became available for Mrs. Crest. The surgery is scheduled for tonight. Dr. Crest is calling it a miracle. I thought you'd want to know." I stared at that text message for a long time, reading it over and over again. The word miracle stood out to me. Dr. Crest was calling it a miracle, as if some divine intervention had suddenly made a compatible heart appear out of nowhere. He had no idea that this miracle was actually the result of professional competence, careful relationship building, and the kind of aggressive pursuit that he had accused me of lacking. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. Jennifer sent another message a few minutes later. "The whole family is here. Dr. Crest is so emotional, he can barely speak. He keeps saying that God answered his prayers. The surgery is going to start in about an hour. I'll let you know how it goes." I thanked her for the updates and asked her to keep me informed. As much as I wanted to be there for the surgery, I knew that my presence would only complicate things. This was Mrs. Crest's moment, and I didn't want anything to interfere with her chance at survival. The surgery took 8 hours. I didn't sleep at all that night, constantly checking my phone for updates from Jennifer. Around 3 in the morning, I received the message I had been hoping for. "Surgery successful. Heart is beating strong. Mrs. Crest is stable. Dr. Crest is crying tears of joy, says it's the best day of his life." I felt a wave of relief and satisfaction wash over me. Mrs. Crest was going to live. The woman who had been dying while her son blamed everyone else for his inability to save her was now going to have a second chance at life, thanks to the coordinator he had fired for incompetence. But the story wasn't over yet. The next morning, Jennifer called me directly. "Sarah, you should have seen what happened after the surgery. Dr. Crest gathered the entire family in the waiting room, and he made this big speech about how grateful he was to God for providing a heart for his mother. He talked about how prayer and faith had made the difference, how this was proof that miracles still happen in modern medicine. Then he thanked the hospital staff, the surgical team, and even the new transplant coordinator who had only been on the job for 6 hours. I laughed despite myself. 6 hours? They replaced me with someone who had been there for 6 hours? Jennifer confirmed that the replacement coordinator had been hired from another hospital and had literally just started work that morning. The poor guy looked terrified when Dr. Crest started praising him for his excellent work in securing the heart. He kept trying to explain that he had nothing to do with it, that the organ had already been allocated when he arrived, but Dr. Crest wouldn't listen. He just kept going on about how this was what real competence looked like. The image of Dr. Crest praising his new coordinator for work that I had actually done was almost too poetic to believe. Here was a man who had fired me for not being aggressive enough in pursuing organs for his mother, now crediting someone else for the very success that my aggressiveness had achieved. The new coordinator, who had done absolutely nothing to help Mrs. Crest, was being hailed as a hero, while I, who had actually saved her life, remained invisible and unacknowledged. But that invisibility was exactly what made this situation so satisfying. Dr. Crest would never know that the woman he had humiliated and fired had been the one to save his mother's life. He would never realize that his arrogance and cruelty had nearly cost his mother her only chance at survival. He would never understand that the miracle he was crediting to God was actually the result of professional competence and human compassion. His ignorance was my victory, his gratitude was my vindication, and his mother's survival was my revenge. Over the following days, I received periodic updates from Jennifer about Mrs. Crest's recovery. The surgery had been completely successful, and she was responding well to the anti-rejection medications. Her prognosis was excellent, and the doctors expected her to make a full recovery. Dr. Crest had returned to his normal, arrogant self, but Jennifer said he seemed different somehow, more humble and grateful. "He's been nicer to the staff lately," she told me. "I think almost losing his mother changed him a little bit." I was genuinely happy to hear about Mrs. Crest's recovery, but I felt no satisfaction in learning about her son's supposed transformation. Nice behavior motivated by gratitude for a miracle that he didn't understand wasn't real change. It was just emotional manipulation by circumstances. If Dr. Crest had truly learned something from this experience, he would have reached out to apologize for his treatment of me. He would have acknowledged that his anger and desperation had led him to make unfair accusations. But no such apology ever came, because in his mind, he had done nothing wrong. My firing had been justified, and the successful outcome had vindicated his decision to replace me. About a week after the surgery, I received an unexpected phone call from David Martinez. "Sarah, I wanted to follow up on that case we worked on together. I heard the surgery was successful, which is fantastic news. But I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to ask you directly. Are you still working at St. Mary's? Because when I called to coordinate the organ allocation, I spoke with someone who seemed completely unfamiliar with the case. He kept asking me for basic information that I thought you would have already provided. I took a deep breath and decided to tell David the truth. I explained that I had been fired from St. Mary's the day before I called him, and that my request for help had been made as a private citizen, rather than as an official hospital representative. I told him about Dr. Crest's accusations, his public humiliation of me, and his decision to fire me for incompetence. David listened without interruption, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, I can't believe what I'm hearing. You were fired for incompetence, and then you used your own personal relationships to save the life of the person whose case got you fired? That's either the most professional thing I've ever heard, or the most personal revenge I've ever witnessed." I thought about his words carefully. "Maybe it's both," I replied. "I couldn't let an innocent woman die because her son was too proud to admit he was wrong. But I also couldn't let him get away with destroying my career without proving that his accusations were baseless." David laughed, a sound filled with admiration and disbelief. "You know what this means, don't you? You've just demonstrated that you're a better transplant coordinator than anyone else in your region. You were able to secure a compatible organ in less than 24 hours using nothing but your personal network and professional relationships. That's not incompetence, Sarah. That's excellence." His words meant more to me than any official recognition or performance review ever could. Coming from a peer who understood the challenges and complexities of our profession, His praise was the vindication I had been craving. But David wasn't finished. Actually, I have an idea. We've been looking for a senior transplant coordinator here at Denver General. The position pays significantly more than what you were making at St. Mary's, and it comes with a lot more autonomy and respect. Would you be interested in hearing about it? I felt my heart skip a beat. The possibility of not just finding a new job, but finding a better job, seemed almost too good to be true. I would definitely be interested, I told him, but I should mention that I was fired from my last position, and that might complicate things. David dismissed my concern immediately. Sarah, anyone who can accomplish what you just accomplished is exactly the kind of person we want on our team. I'll personally recommend you for the position, and I'll make sure the hiring committee understands the real circumstances of your departure from St. Mary's. Trust me, your reputation in the transplant community is stellar. One jealous surgeon's opinion isn't going to change that. The job interview process at Denver General was unlike anything I had experienced at St. Mary's. Instead of being questioned about my qualifications or my commitment to the profession, I was asked to describe my approach to building relationships with other coordinators, my strategies for navigating complex allocation scenarios, and my methods for advocating for patients in difficult situations. The interview panel seemed genuinely interested in my professional philosophy and my vision for improving transplant outcomes. When they offered me the position, it came with a 30% salary increase and the title of Senior Transplant Coordinator. My last week in the city was bittersweet. I was excited about the new opportunity, but I was also sad to leave behind the relationships and connections I had built over the years. Jennifer threw me a small going-away party at her apartment, inviting several of the nurses and residents who had worked with me at St. Mary's. It was a chance to say goodbye properly, something I hadn't been able to do when I was escorted out of the hospital after being fired. During the party, one of the newer residents asked me about the Mrs. Crest case. Sarah, I heard that a heart became available for Dr. Crest's mother just hours after you were let go. That must have been frustrating, knowing that if you had stayed just one more day, you might have been credited with finding that organ. I smiled and took a sip of my wine. You know what? I'm not frustrated at all. Mrs. Crest got the heart she needed, and that's what really matters. Everything else is just politics and ego. But as I said those words, I realized that I wasn't being entirely honest. I wasn't frustrated about not receiving credit for finding the heart, because I knew the truth about what had actually happened. I wasn't disappointed about missing out on the glory, because the real satisfaction came from knowing that I had outperformed everyone's expectations while remaining completely invisible. Dr. Crest's ignorance about my role in saving his mother's life wasn't a source of frustration. It was the most perfect form of vindication I could have imagined. The night before I left for Denver, I drove past St. Mary's Medical Center one last time. The building looked the same as always, its windows glowing with the warm light of constant activity. I thought about Mrs. Crest, hopefully recovering well from her surgery and looking forward to many more years of life. I thought about Dr. Crest, probably back to his old arrogant self, never knowing how close his pride had come to costing his mother everything. And I thought about myself, about how this experience had taught me something important about professional integrity and personal strength. As I sat in my car outside the hospital, I realized that the best revenge isn't always the one that makes your enemy suffer. Sometimes the best revenge is the one that proves your worth while remaining completely invisible to the person who wronged you. Dr. Crest would never know that the woman he had fired for incompetence had been the one to save his mother's life. He would never realize that his accusations had been not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. He would never understand that his decision to fire me had been the single greatest mistake of his professional career. But I would know. I would carry the knowledge of what I had accomplished, the satisfaction of having done the right thing despite being treated unfairly, and the confidence that comes from proving your worth in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Dr. Crest had tried to destroy my career, but instead he had given me the opportunity to demonstrate just how valuable I really was. He had intended to humiliate me, but instead he had created the conditions for my greatest professional triumph. My first day at Denver General was everything I had hoped it would be. The transplant team welcomed me with genuine enthusiasm, and I was immediately given the autonomy and respect that I had been denied at St. Mary's. My new colleagues were interested in my ideas, my methods, and my vision for improving patient outcomes. Within my first week, I had already facilitated 2 successful transplants, including one that required extensive coordination with multiple hospitals across 3 states. But the real validation came about a month into my new job, when I received a call from Dr. Patricia Chen, the head of transplant services at Denver General. Sarah, I wanted to let you know that I've been hearing remarkable things about you from coordinators across the country. Apparently, your reputation for excellence and professionalism is well known throughout the transplant community. I'm curious about something, though. The person who recommended you for this position mentioned that you were able to secure a compatible heart for a patient in less than 24 hours using only your personal network. Is that true? I confirmed that it was true, and Dr. Chen asked me to explain how I had accomplished it. I described my relationships with other coordinators, my approach to building trust and reciprocity, and my philosophy of putting patient welfare above institutional politics. When I finished, Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. Sarah, what you're describing is exactly the kind of innovative thinking and professional excellence that we want to encourage here. Would you be interested in developing a training program for other coordinators based on your methods? The opportunity to share my knowledge and approach with other professionals was incredibly appealing. Over the following months, I developed a comprehensive training program that focused on relationship building, communication skills, and ethical decision-making in complex situations. The program was eventually adopted by several other hospitals in the region, and I was invited to speak at national conferences about best practices in transplant coordination. But the most satisfying moment came about 6 months after I started at Denver General, when I received a call from a coordinator at a hospital in Texas. Sarah, I wanted to thank you for the training program you developed. I just used the relationship-building techniques you taught us to secure a liver for a patient who had been waiting for over a year. The family is calling it a miracle, but I know it was really just good professional practice. I thanked him for the feedback, but his words reminded me of something important. Miracles, I realized, are often just the result of competence, dedication, and human compassion working together in ways that aren't immediately visible. Dr. Crest had called his mother's heart transplant a miracle, never knowing that it was actually the result of professional excellence and personal integrity. The families of the patients I had helped at Denver General were calling their loved ones' recoveries miracles, not understanding the complex web of relationships and skills that had made those recoveries possible. But I was comfortable with that invisibility. I had learned that the most meaningful recognition comes not from public praise or official acknowledgement, but from the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you've done your job well, that you've made a difference in people's lives, and that you've maintained your integrity even when others have questioned it. Dr. Crest had tried to destroy my career by publicly humiliating me and firing me for incompetence. Instead, he had given me the opportunity to prove my worth in the most dramatic way possible. The ultimate irony was that Dr. Crest's attempt to punish me for failing his mother had actually created the conditions for me to save her life. His anger and pride had blinded him to the truth about my abilities, and his decision to fire me had removed the institutional constraints that might have prevented me from using my personal network to help his mother. By trying to destroy me, he had inadvertently freed me to demonstrate the full extent of my professional capabilities. I never contacted Dr. Crest or anyone else at St. Mary's to reveal the truth about what had happened. I never sought recognition or credit for my role in saving Mrs. Crest's life. I never even told my colleagues at Denver General the full story of how I had been treated at my previous job. The satisfaction I felt didn't come from revenge or vindication. It came from the knowledge that I had acted with integrity and professionalism, even when others had failed to do so. Sometimes I wonder if Dr. Crest ever thinks about the timing of his mother's heart transplant. Does he ever question how a compatible organ became available so quickly after he fired his supposedly incompetent transplant coordinator? Does he ever wonder about the circumstances that led to his mother's miracle? I suspect that he doesn't, because admitting the possibility would require him to acknowledge that he had been wrong about me, and men like Dr. Crest rarely admit to being wrong about anything. But his ignorance is part of what makes this situation so perfectly satisfying. He gets to live with the belief that he made the right decision, that firing me was justified, and that his mother's survival was the result of divine intervention or institutional excellence. He never has to confront the uncomfortable truth that his arrogance nearly cost his mother her life, and that the woman he publicly humiliated was the one who ultimately saved her. Years have passed since that dramatic week at St. Mary's Medical Center, and I've continued to build my career in transplant coordination. I've facilitated hundreds of successful transplants, trained dozens of new coordinators, and developed innovative protocols that have been adopted by hospitals across the country. My reputation in the transplant community has grown to the point where I'm frequently consulted on the most complex and challenging cases. But none of my subsequent achievements have felt as meaningful as that single phone call I made to David Martinez on a sleepless night when I had nothing left to lose except my integrity. The transplant community is smaller than most people realize, and news travels fast among coordinators. Over the years, I've heard occasional updates about St. Mary's Medical Center and Dr. Crest's department. The hospital has struggled with transplant coordination since my departure, cycling through several coordinators who were unable to match the success rates and relationships that I had built. Dr. Crest himself has apparently become more demanding and difficult to work with, perhaps because he's never been able to replicate the miracle that saved his mother's life. I learned from a colleague that Mrs. Crest made a full recovery and lived for several more years before passing away from an unrelated illness. During those extra years, she was able to see her grandchildren graduate from college, attend family weddings, and enjoy the simple pleasures of life that her heart transplant had made possible. She never knew that her survival was due to the efforts of a young woman her son had fired for incompetence. She probably went to her grave believing that her recovery was a miracle sent from heaven, and in a way, she was right. Sometimes miracles work through human hands and professional networks, rather than through supernatural intervention. The most satisfying update I received came about 3 years after I left St. Mary's, when Jennifer called to tell me that Dr. Crest had been passed over for a promotion to department head. The hospital administration cited concerns about his leadership style and his treatment of staff, she explained. Apparently, several coordinators have filed complaints about his behavior, and the turnover rate in his department has become a real problem. The board decided they needed someone who could work more collaboratively with the transplant team. I felt a moment of vindication hearing that news, but it was quickly replaced by sadness. Dr. Crest's inability to learn from his mistakes had cost him a promotion and had probably compromised patient care at his hospital. If he had taken the time to understand why I had been successful in my role, if he had recognized that my methods were effective rather than dismissing them as inadequate, he might have become a better leader and a better doctor. Instead, his pride and arrogance had created a pattern of dysfunction that had followed him throughout his career. But perhaps the most poetic aspect of this entire story is how it demonstrates the power of quiet competence over loud arrogance. Dr. Crest was a man who commanded attention through intimidation and demands. He made sure everyone knew how important he was, how much pressure he was under, and how disappointed he was in everyone else's performance. His approach to leadership was based on fear and hierarchy, on the assumption that being loud and demanding would somehow produce better results. In contrast, my approach was based on relationships, trust, and quiet competence. I didn't demand recognition or credit. I didn't threaten or intimidate. I simply did my job well, built strong professional relationships, and maintained my integrity even when others questioned it. When the crisis came, when Mrs. Crest's life hung in the balance, it wasn't Dr. Crest's demanding leadership that saved her. It was the network of relationships I had built through years of professional respect and mutual support. The lesson I learned from this experience goes far beyond the specifics of transplant coordination or hospital politics. It's a lesson about the power of competence over arrogance, about the importance of building relationships rather than burning bridges, and about the satisfaction that comes from doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Dr. Crest tried to destroy my career because he couldn't handle the pressure of his mother's illness and needed someone to blame. But by firing me, he created the conditions for me to demonstrate my true value in the most dramatic way possible. I've often thought about what would have happened if I had chosen a different path that night when I was sitting in my apartment, angry and humiliated, and faced with the knowledge that an innocent woman might die because of her son's pride. I could have simply walked away, satisfied that Dr. Crest's treatment of me would eventually catch up with him. I could have focused on finding a new job and rebuilding my career without giving Mrs. Crest another thought. I could have let anger and resentment consume me, turning me into the kind of bitter, vindictive person who seeks revenge through destruction rather than through excellence. But I chose a different path. I chose to act with integrity and professionalism even when others had failed to do so. I chose to put patient welfare above my own wounded pride. I chose to use my skills and relationships to save a life rather than to seek petty revenge. And in making that choice, I discovered something important about myself and about the nature of true professional satisfaction. The revenge I achieved wasn't the kind that involves public humiliation or professional destruction. It was subtler and more satisfying than that. It was the revenge of proving my worth through actions rather than words, of demonstrating my competence through results rather than through arguments. It was the revenge of knowing that the person who had wronged me owed his mother's life to the very skills and relationships he had dismissed as inadequate. Dr. Crest spent years believing that he had made the right decision in firing me, that his mother's survival was evidence of his good judgment and leadership. He never knew that his supposed vindication was actually the result of my competence and compassion. He never realized that the miracle he credited to divine intervention was actually the product of human excellence and professional integrity. His ignorance was my victory, his gratitude was my vindication, and his mother's survival was my revenge. In the end, the most satisfying revenge is often the one that your enemy never realizes has happened. Dr. Crest lives with the comfortable belief that he was right to fire me, that his mother's recovery proved his decision was justified, and that his leadership was vindicated by the successful outcome. He never has to confront the uncomfortable truth that his arrogance nearly killed his mother, and that the woman he publicly humiliated was the one who ultimately saved her life. But I know the truth. I carry the knowledge of what really happened, the satisfaction of having acted with integrity under pressure, and the confidence that comes from proving your worth in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Dr. Crest tried to destroy my career, but instead he gave me the opportunity to demonstrate the full extent of my professional capabilities. He intended to humiliate me, but instead he created the conditions for my greatest professional triumph. The years have passed, and I've moved on to bigger and better things. I've built a successful career, earned the respect of my colleagues, and made a real difference in countless lives. But I'll never forget that night when I sat in my apartment with nothing left to lose except my integrity, and I chose to use my skills to save the life of a woman whose son had tried to destroy me. That choice defined not just my career, but my character. It showed me who I really was when everything else was stripped away. And sometimes, late at night when I'm coordinating a particularly complex transplant case, I think about Mrs. Crest and the heart that saved her life. I think about Dr. Crest, probably still convinced that he made the right decision all those years ago. I think about the power of quiet competence over loud arrogance, about the importance of building relationships rather than burning bridges, and about the satisfaction that comes from doing the right thing even when no one is watching. The surgeon praised God for his mother's new heart, unaware it was found by the nurse he had fired. And in that ignorance, in that complete lack of understanding about what had really happened, I found the most perfect form of professional revenge imaginable. Not the kind that destroys or humiliates, but the kind that proves your worth while remaining completely invisible to the person who wronged you. The kind that lets your enemy live with their comfortable delusions while you carry the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth. Dr. Crest got his miracle, his mother got her life, and I got my revenge. But only one of us knows how all three of those things really happened. And that knowledge, that secret satisfaction, that quiet vindication of my professional worth, is more valuable than any recognition or apology could ever be. Because in the end, the best revenge isn't always the one that makes your enemy suffer. Sometimes the best revenge is the one that proves your worth while remaining completely invisible to the person who tried to destroy you. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being excellent at what you do, even when no one is watching, even when no one will ever know, even when the only satisfaction comes from the quiet knowledge that you did the right thing when it mattered most. That's my story. That's my revenge. And that's why I know that competence, integrity, and quiet professionalism will always triumph over arrogance, pride, and loud demands. Dr. Crest may never know what really happened, but I do. And that's enough. Hit the like button on this video if you believe that the best revenge is the one your enemy never knows happened. Comment below, what was the most unfair situation you've ever faced at work? And how did you handle it? Subscribe to Hospital Revenge for more stories of healthcare professionals who found creative ways to deal with injustices in the hospital environment. Because sometimes, the best revenge is simply being excellent at what you do, even when no one is watching.